Okay, so the books we've looked at so far fall into the war with China narrative. A part of the war with China narrative is power relations. Yes, China's power is rising, but not just in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. China's power is rising at a time when the US's power is declining. American declinism forms a big part of this literature. For some authors, American decline is a sad reality. For others, it's a call to arms, an argument to put more emphasis on US military and strategic resources. But another part of that war with China narrative is that China is increasingly shaping the world in its own image. One of the main examples of this argument is presented by Stefan Halper in his The Beijing Consensus, How China's Authoritarian Model Will Dominate the 21st Century. We can look at the Beijing Consensus, which is a play on the Washington Consensus, in the seminars. For now, I want to present the argument in this book in its simplest terms. China will not be content with merely joining the current international economic system, as that system has inherent Western or US bias. China will instead work to shape the world in its own interest. That interest will not only be on an economic front, but also politically, and China has little interest in democracy. Inherent in this narrative is the decline of US power. When other states are looking at the great powers of the world, which model should they seek to emulate? The US model, which has seen low economic growth for a prolonged period, or China, which has seen high growth for a long period? Another way in which China will apparently be able to extend its power is by the willing acquiescence of the US. One such proponent of this thesis is James Mann with his The China Fantasy, How Our Leaders Explain Away Chinese Repression. Mann presents three views of China's future. The first is his soothing scenario. China's successful experiment with capitalism will lead to democratization. The second is his upheaval scenario. Increasing capitalism in China will lead to inequality, which will lead to state collapse. The third scenario is called the third scenario. Capitalism continues in China, the democratization doesn't happen, and the state doesn't collapse. Mann's book was published in 2007, and in the intervening 13 years, we've certainly been in that third scenario. Capitalism has continued. Democratization hasn't happened, and the state hasn't collapsed. But I think Mann's narrative requires a joined-up thinking or an overall Western strategy that simply does not exist. Indeed, one that would struggle to exist in a democracy, let alone a vague coalition of democracies. He writes, "The underlying premise of the American proponents of integration is that we can put off until many years from now the question of Chinese democracy. Let China develop, so goes the argument, let the country get richer, let it be integrated into organizations like the World Trade Organization, and then, 2 or 3 decades from now, it may be a more advantageous time to try and push hard for China to open up its political system." I'm not convinced by this narrative. I don't know who these proponents of integration are, and whoever they are, I'm not sure that they are the main drivers of foreign policy. Taking that view rather more stridently is Peter Kiernan with his deliberately provocative "Becoming China's Bitch and 9 More Catastrophes We Must Avoid Right Now, a Manifesto for the Radical Centre." The title of this book alone should indicate its quality. It's unnecessarily offensive, it has 2 subtitles, and it refers to a radical centre, which doesn't make any sense. Kiernan's book is very much about the US more than it is about China, and indeed, of the 10 problems facing the US identified by the book, China is only one of them. Kiernan tells us that what we are facing is nothing less than a test of American independence. We have a codependency with China for goods, services and production, and we need to set boundaries. China is also back to double-digit defense spending increases. Make no mistake, China intends to be a world military power, and it spends like one. Kiernan paints a narrative in which overdependence on China will be a problem for the US in future. but it is an avoidable problem. Remember, becoming China's bitch is not inevitable. Nothing is historically ordained until inaction makes sure that it is. Anchoring in the snug and safe harbour of debt for exports codependency is one certain way to ensure a catastrophic outcome in our relations with China. The ways in which the US can avoid this problem are not through an all-out decoupling with China, however. Kiernan sees some form of integration as being unavoidable, but Kiernan calls for some rebalancing, what he refers to as 5/5, a 5% per year revaluation over 5 years, depending on certain agreed-to measure of trade imbalance